little pre-show. And let me try that again. If you caught this part of the video, you've got the live unedited edition. Home Gadget Geeks Thursday night. It's the 19th of January, 2023, 8 p.m. in the Central Time Zone, 9 Eastern. If you've got this any other time than that, you've just got the recorded version. It's okay. Hang tight. We got a little pre-show, and then we'll get started here shortly. I got Christian Johnson with me. And Christian, we were spending a little time talking about Chat GPT. We're going to talk about LastPass and Bitwarden here just in a few minutes. But in light of a beer pour or a whiskey pour, what do you think? This thing has come storming on the scene in the last month or two, and it just seems like what everybody's talking about. What do you think about this Chat GPT?
It's not your traditional Alice chatbot, that's for sure. I really think generative AI caught a lot of the industry by surprise at how good it can be, and how well it can be trained up. I was just getting ready to tell you before we went on the pre-show that some coworkers and I took the one of our standard interview questions that we like to give to software engineers, and we have different calibration criteria for like a junior, mid-level, senior level software engineer, and you can ask the same question to all three caliber of software engineer, and based on their responses and what they pick up on and what they don't pick up on, you can kind of determine whether they're raising the bar or not at that level. And so we said, well, why not give that question to Chat GPT and see how it does? And I mean, it was able to generate responses in 2 different languages, and not just like the dumb, like brute force implementation, but when you asked it, is there a smarter way to do this than what you gave me? Yeah, there is. And here it is. And here's why. And when you start asking it about what its performance considerations are, and what are some better syntax and style considerations, and I mean, it was really unbelievable when we actually finished the interview with Chat GPT and printed the transcript and then compared it to our rubric and to past candidate answers. Chat GPT scored, at bar for a SDE2 at Amazon for that question, which was like shocking stuff, like not something that AI bots in the past would have been able to do.
Well, what got us talking about it is you've done some work over at the Average Guy.tv. You were logging in to check something. You saw an article. You're like, you clicked on it. You read the article, and you were thinking, "Wonder if that Jim wrote that with Chat GPT." Yeah. So you asked me that. I just been hoping someone would ask me that question, because if you go back, I don't know, the last 10 articles, maybe 7 of them have been written not 100%, but let's say 99%. I've gone in and changed a few things just to make more sense to me. But
as good and as accurate as it is, you can kind of, you can see the generative persona if you're awake and paying attention, right? Yeah. So if you know to look for it, you'll see it.
Yeah. If you go out to the averageguy.tv right now, you can see, I think I posted one. Let's see, what's the one? Oh, well, I wrote one called streamlining blog writing with ChatGPT, and the pros and cons of using AI to generate text, because this has been such a hot topic. Well, it generated that about itself. Like, that is an article. I said, hey, what are some pros and cons of writing, of using ChatGPT to write blog posts? That whole post is its commentary on itself, which is a little meta from that perspective. But good stuff. Now, not always accurate. I was having a conversation with it about myself, and was like, hey, tell me a little bit about Jim Collison and the one who the podcaster for Home Gadget Geeks. And it pulled back a pretty decent bio about me. And it was like, hey, a podcaster for Home Gadget Geeks, does Called the Coach, joins Dave Jackson on Ask the Podcast Coach. That was crazy that I got that. Huh. And then he's an IT enthusiast, some other things. When I asked it about my Gallup work, it thought I was a Gallup certified strengths coach, which I'm not. So that was wrong.
You're so associated with that keyword. I wouldn't blame a human for saying that.
I was going to say, many humans get that wrong, Yeah. So not, and there's been a few things. I was doing some historical, which I've got kind of in the backlog of post ideas. about the history. Tell me about, I've been thinking and talking a lot about bourbons, and I was like, give me the history of Buffalo Trace, or give me the history of Jack Daniels, Jim Beam, some of those. And one of them, it got totally wrong. Like it just it missed it. It kind of missed the initial off ramp, and then it kind of went all avenues of. I mean, it's kind of close, but it wasn't all the way there. But man, I tell you what, from a writing perspective, it's crazy. Now, did you have to give code examples? Yeah, you said you had it write 2 different languages, and
Yeah,
you
we had
can.
it write it in Python and Lisp, and we don't really care if people can write in Lisp because it's pretty much an academic language at this point. But what's very interesting is how well it knows difference in language features, and it can explain to you what software engineers would vomit about writing something in one language and not in the other.
Mhm.
So that was just very interesting. But I mean, it has a very deep understanding of edge cases and bugs and the types of things that people pay software engineers big money to get right is something that it's able to do on its own. So it's like,
Mhm.
just like folks were saying, smart contracts and blockchain, we're going to replace a lot of the need to have attorneys do contracts. It's like, maybe generative AI will just replace the average programmer because we won't need average programmers. We'll just need people who can develop and keep the AI from misbehaving.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's now becoming a story in itself. There's some I was reading a news article today that they paid some folks in Kenya pretty low wages to do some tagging and some work on this. And of course, the big concern is this thing will become racist or sexist or violent, right? And so I guess there were a lot of folks trying to get it to do that, and they've just done a lot of the training. I don't, there's some probably some ethics involved, and the methods used to make sure this model doesn't do that. It's
Yeah.
not what we're going to talk about, but certainly it's the dark side, right? It's the dark side of some of this AI. So, um, but just from an out the door usage standpoint, man, it is incredible. If you're stuck, like you need some ideas,
Yep.
like, hey, give me 7 ideas on something I could do today, and and they're pretty good. You're like, huh, all right. So, I I know they're going to come up with okay. This already exists in a product called Jasper, which was Jarvis before that. Very similar. I think it's a different model. I think I don't know, to be honest. Do you know anything about Jasper or Jarvis? Have
No.
you? Yeah, same kind of idea, same kind of concept. You can ask it to do things, and it'll write copy and add copy and some of those kinds of things for you, which ChatGPT would do. One, it needs a better name, just to be honest. And then 2, I think we're going to probably see a paid model. Whoops. Well, there goes Christian. He'll be back here in just a second. I would think there's going to be a paid model here pretty fast. So there's Christian's back. I think there'll be a paid model pretty quick. Don't you think that? And then because they just got hammered from a resources standpoint.
Yeah. Well, it's also interesting though how they created that whole foundation, and I mean, it's shocking to me that this level of tech is owned at a foundation level right now. And I think I
Mm,
want to say Microsoft just put another bucket of money into it,
I
but
think they did. I think
I
they
mean,
did.
by and
Yeah,
large, it's like who's going to be the first big tech company to, wipe out the foundation and put it into their products?
yeah.
Because a lot of people are arguing that it's going to make Siri and Google Home Assistant and Alexa kind of look like, you know, yesterday's tech as far as
Oh, for
the
sure.
conversational aspect is concerned.
It was making while it was offline. They ran enough that it was making limericks about itself on the login page. It was like, sorry, we can't, like, we're just overutilized, but while you're waiting, here's some limericks. And it just came up with and it was just generating these limericks about itself, which is
Yep.
scary and interesting. Yeah, Ken says sounds like a good Cyber Frontiers episode. We'll probably have you back here on Home Gadget Geeks to talk about it again. I think maybe we'll give it a little bit more time to see where things go with it. If you haven't checked it out yet, head out to chat.openai.com. It's having various challenges staying open, just with as many people who are trying to use it. Christian, do you think that there'll be an initial rush, and then people will get kind of bored with it and like, well, okay, we're done, and it'll kind of back off and get more available? Any thoughts on usage just by the
do think
population?
probably a lot of folks who are not in the AI ML space are getting their hands on it right now, which is probably a good source of the traffic surge. And I think those folks may lose interest over time, but I do think the folks who are in that community are going to be learning as much about it as they can before it gets bought out and the IP goes underground, and thinking about how to invest in GPT into their own ecosystems. So I think there's going to be a lot of demand and interest in it, just because I think it succeeded in catching a lot of people off guard about how far it had come.
Yeah. I just asked it the question, what would be a good topic tonight to have on Home Gadget Geeks with Christian Johnson? And it says, not aware of any specific context related to a Home Gadget Geeks podcast or the interest of a person named Christian Johnson. I like that's a good answer.
That's a good feature. Yeah.
There are many interesting and relevant topics. This is where you start seeing the patterns in it, right? There are many interesting and relevant topics related to Home Gadget Geeks, or to go Home Gadgets, that can make for an engaging podcast episode. Here's just a few ideas, right? Smart home technology and how it can be used to improve energy efficiency and home security. 2, the latest developments in home automation and voice control systems. 3, the review of the latest home entertainment technology, including 4K TV, streaming devices, and surround sound systems. 5, an interview with the latest kitchen gadgets and appliances and how they can be used to make cooking and meal prep easier. 6, and last one, a discussion of the latest trends in home fitness technology and how to use it to stay in shape while working out at home. Please take into consideration that these are just a few suggestions. The ultimate topic choice will depend on the interest of your audience and the focus of your podcast. That's pretty good. There's some good, and then what I could do and what I've done is I've been writing some things. Again, if you want to see some chat GPT written articles, just about everything that's not in the last couple weeks, that's not an episode, was written. Most of it was written by this. So I changed some things around a little bit. But what I would do then is pick each one of these bullet points and say, like, the first one was home security technology and how it can be used to improve energy efficiency and home security. And I just turn that into a question, right? You go out there, take that statement, tell me 3 benefits of smart home technology and how it can be used to improve energy efficiency and home security. And I'd say, like, give me 800 words, do this 800 words. I think there's a temperature switch, and you can say serious or funny or whatever, skeptical, maybe. Be a good one to try. So yeah, some cool stuff. Jim Shoemaker says knowledge cut off at 2021. I think yes, but I think they've added more since then. As I'm looking at the site, it says the January. Oh no, this is the January 9th version, which I think has newer content in it. Let's look really quick. Because you can't ask it anything. I think that's wrong. We should ask GPT or Chat GPT what it thinks. You can't ask anything current. It doesn't get really specific with people, although it knew who I was, which is interesting. So I don't know.
It's all that Gallup Strength Center stuff. It's just all
this podcast. Yeah, and it kind of makes me wonder, Christian, if it's like, what about audio? Yeah, we know it's trained on written content, but what about audio content that's out there, and what about transcribed audio content? That's really where, I I have a lot of transcripts from the Gallup side of things that have my name associated with a transcript.
Yeah.
So I'm sure that'd be pretty easy to discover. You could go out and say, tell me all the things Jim said about this. And if those were indexed in some way and it knew. Yeah, I think you're right. Jim said it told him that the knowledge cutoff was 2021. I think that has been out there. It also admits it makes mistakes. Tony says maybe it can write my progress notes to on my patient rounds. Maybe not now because it doesn't have that knowledge, but maybe in the future it can. And Brian says self-aware machines. Nothing bad can happen from that. Well, only in movies. I think we're going to be okay. Don't you think? Don't you think we're going to be okay with self-aware robots? They're coming, right?
It'll be fine.
We're gonna have them at some point, right?
It'll all work out.
Okay. All right. I won't put you on record as saying yes or no. All right. We are here to talk some Bitwarden and LastPass. Christian, I've got some real questions about me that I need to get answered. So so I know what to do. I am seriously lamenting moving. Like, we'll talk about it when we get there. Let me kick this thing off. This is the Average Guy Network, and you have found Home Gadget Geeks show number 559, recorded on January 19th, 2023. Here on Home Gadget Geeks, we cover all the favorite tech gadgets that find their way into your home. News, reviews, product updates, and conversation, all for the average tech guy. I'm your host, Jim Collison, broadcasting live from the AverageGuy.tv studios here in a chilly and snowy and got some ice, Bellevue, Nebraska. Of course, we post a show with some world-class show notes, and we'll have a few for you tonight. Christian's got some great notes out there. We'll post them out there at the AverageGuy.tv. Big thanks to John Maddox, who joined us last week from Channels, just a good friend of the show, and we had a fun conversation about what's new at Channels. If you haven't checked it out yet, head out to the AverageGuy.tv/HGG558, and you can catch up on that conversation. And John, thanks for coming on. Big thanks to our Patreon subscribers, which help make all the magic happen here on Home Gadget Geeks. And if you're finding value in the podcast and you want to give that value back, of course, you can do that through Patreon. Head out to the AverageGuy.tv/Patreon. Of course, you guys know a big supporter and big contributor to what we do here is Christian Johnson. And Christian, welcome back to Home Gadget Geeks.
Hey, thanks, Jim. It's great to be back. And I can't believe that we're in 2023 and we're still talking about password managers as this like proverbial difficult technology. But okay, here we are.
Well, in a little bit. So we're going to talk about LastPass, and specifically, we're going to, as we think about what do we do next, Christian wanted to talk about Bitwarden. So that's coming up. Christian, let's back up though just a little bit, because as you say that, I don't think, we're at a spot where we're arguing about what to do anymore. We know, password managers are out there. We know why we use them and the complexity of them and such. The problem is, for me, is actually the opposite, is that I'm having a hard time like the work effort to come off of one, to me, seems like a lot. Now, maybe it's easier than I'm thinking, and I hope you're going to convince me of that as we're talking through. But let's back up a little bit. Let's talk from what what went wrong at LastPass. I mean, they were friends of the show. They were a sponsor here for a lot of years. We knew them from the inside. A lot of great things going on over there, and maybe some purchases and some sales and some other things happening. Let things go a little loose. But what do we know?
Yeah. So definitely a lot to unpack on the show tonight. I'm going to do my best to kind of walk you through what's going on with LastPass, what's going on with some of the other password managers that are near and dear to people's hearts. What are some of the things to be looking out for in evaluating them? Because I think a lot of folks there's just this wall of buy this password manager, buy this one. What are the feature differences, et cetera? So I'm really going to try and break down how they are evolving and what are some of the key discriminators for them. I'm also going to talk a little bit about what are some of the principles from a cryptography standpoint around what the password managers in 2023 are doing today, and maybe how that differs from what they were doing a decade ago. And then I will also talk about my journey migrating from, in this case, from RoboForm to Bitwarden, and making that a fairly um, pain-free process. So I believe kind of one of the great things is that if you know what you're doing and you do it correctly and take the right precautions, it actually, you can migrate to between any of the big password managers out there with fairly little ease. So I'll make sure we cover that tonight as well. But what do we know about LastPass? So this is really what people think of as a second breach. And I do want to give a shout out to the Almost Secure blog. Just go to palant.info, palant.info. A lot of great write up and discussion on both just the LastPass sagas as well as a lot of other security topics. They do a really nice job breaking down what's going on in fairly digestible terms. So some of the things I'm going to quote and talk about with just where are we with what happened in December of 22, reference and credit to that blog. So this really started when LastPass made an updated vulnerability disclosure, for lack of a better word, or breach disclosure in December, which they couched as this kind of secondary independent event to when their kind of development environment and some of their source code and technical secret sauce got compromised and stolen back in August. One of the things I really like about what this author characterizes is that it's not really a separate event. It's really clear that they failed to contain the first breach and really clean that up effectively. And so some of what I'm going to talk about with what went wrong with LastPass, I think also is applicable to many of the other password managers over the last 10 years. So if you look at other vulnerabilities and problems and write-ups that have been done, I'll talk a little bit about some of the ones that happened with RoboForm as a kind of example as well. But many of them kind of come back to some of these central themes where you would look at a password manager, let's just say in 2013, 2014, they'd all advertise to you kind of the same buzzwords, right? So everyone's going to talk about 256 AES encryption, and we're using military grade encryption. And gee, doesn't that sound special? Well, for the average guy that doesn't really understand what's behind that, gee, if it's good enough for the military, it must be good enough for me, right? So that has been one of the most kind of frequent sales pitches that you see in all of this. And the sales pitches have gotten more clever as they take technical primitives and find the right buzzwords to match to them. So some of the other things you'll see that are fun in the LastPass breach write-up is not only are they talking about 256-bit encryption, but they talk about, zero knowledge architecture. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means, because it's very much the foundation of how all these password managers are working today, especially ones that are the, sync from anywhere, which really became a hot feature starting somewhere in the 2014, 2015 era where, hey, I want to be able to store my passwords securely no matter what device I'm on and use them everywhere and not worried about having those passwords get owned. So that's where the concept of, well, you need a zero knowledge architecture to do that kind of comes into play. So while that all sounds kind of really assuring and well and good, some of the key things that I think consistently get overlooked if you're not paying attention is that password managers foundationally rely on one simple thing and one simple thing only: the strength of the master key. And if you have created a master password that is not at the complexity requirement that it should be, it really doesn't matter what option you go with, you're going to end up in trouble. Why? Because the whole concept of what zero knowledge essentially means, zero knowledge encryption, is that the password is never stored. So there's no system to go hack the password. It's basically you need to go hack the human if you want to get the password. So the most foundational concept is that your password, it's never stored. What that means is passwords are authentication. They're not encryption. And that's a kind of foundational concept that may get lost in translation for the average guy. So traditionally, passwords deal with authentication. Once you're authenticated, you can then have certain levels of privilege or access, which we talk about as authorization. But those kind of sit in juxtaposition to cryptography, which really deals with confidentiality, integrity, constructs, and non-repudiation. So when we talk about zero knowledge encryption, one of the schemes that's used to provide a kind of zero knowledge architecture is that your master password is used to derive an encryption key locally in your password manager. So what that means is the encryption key isn't actually generated and derived until the master password is known and presented to your local client. And that encryption key stays locally with you on the client. So you're never going to store what the equivalent of a private key is on the server side. So these are two really important primitive foundations to understanding how any password manager like LastPass, like their cloud version, works. And so what the server should only ever be storing in a password manager is essentially the encrypted bits after it's been encrypted locally, then transmitted on the server. So the tenet is you better already be encrypted at rest before you even transmit those bits over the wire for the remote end server to store it. And so what this means is that no matter what device you're on, each local client is going to generate its own encryption key and decryption mechanism based on the zero knowledge that you present to it, which is your master password. And that's how the client then retrieves those encrypted bits back from the server, decomposes it with its own private key, and gets back your plain text password that you care about for the various websites. So in a nutshell, that is the whole foundation for why people place this inherent trust in, well, it's the classic catchphrase of exactly what we're reading about with LastPass, right? Well, I don't care if LastPass ever gets hacked because, it's just a bunch of encrypted bits they got, right? Well, what we really found out in the breach is, yes, but here are some caveats. And those caveats you may really care about depending on who you are, especially if you're a business executive or a security minded individual or someone who is worth a hacker's time to really go after because you have things of inherent value. And so there are a couple key things about LastPass's strategy in the last 5 years that is really important to understanding this breach. The first one goes back to one of the beginning concepts that I talked about, which is that if you do not have a strong, complex master password, you really don't have security as far as these password manager schemes are concerned. And with that, you want to ensure there is a minimum complexity for any master password so that the average consumer who's not tracking these things and loves to type in all sorts of easy, non-complex stuff is not giving themselves in trouble. So the first thing about the LastPass breach is that it wasn't until 2018 that LastPass introduced a requirement that the default character minimum passwords were 12 characters in length. And so that wasn't done until 2018. Furthermore, as we've had LastPass on the show many times, they had a pretty large user base by the time we got to 2018. And one of the key aspects and discoveries about this disclosure was that none of the folks up until 2018 were required to re-baseline to that minimum password complexity. So that means they turned it on for new users going forward, and they probably didn't want to deal with what they amount to a bad customer experience by having to force everyone to re-migrate, alter passwords, play 20 questions with their customers. So suffice to say, in the corpus of knowledge, lots of passwords, master passwords, probably aren't at the complexity that you need to trust them for your individual security. Now, what was the actual just raw LastPass breach? They basically stole backups of all of their vault data for all of their customers on a cloud provider. So it wasn't in their on-prem, which they try to use as a nice deflection of like, oh, it wasn't in our environment. It was off in the cloud, as if that somehow made it better, right? So that, like, one of the things I like about this blog is it really breaks down the press release somewhat systemically and talks about some of the substance customer trust issues that are at play here. But what's notable is that essentially the raw premise of what we're talking about is they have everyone's vault data. Why that's important is that at a very basic level, the hackers who now have that data can interrogate it as much as they want. So if you want to start running crackers against master passwords in a high performance compute environment with lots of GPUs and lots of other things, like, there's not going to be some web server saying, hey, you've exceeded the rate limit, take it easy on trying this master password. Like, no, they're going to be able to sit there and run targeted cracking against specific entities that are of interest. Okay, well, you might ask yourself, how would they know in all of this vault data who's considered a target of interest? Well, one of the key things that is utterly frustrating about the disclosure aspects of the LastPass vulnerability is that, again, one would think that every single field that you ever send to LastPass is encrypted, right? Right? Like, hello, you're a
You'd think,
security company,
you'd
right?
think, yeah,
Right?
yeah.
But and you'll see this in the show notes, like, part of what the security community has been researching is, as part of this vulnerability and disclosure, they analyzed the web vault format of their own vaults, and only 8 of the 38 fields are encrypted. So things like the password, no kidding, are going to be encrypted. Things like the username were encrypted. Okay, great. Things like notes encrypted. Great. But what are some things that aren't encrypted? Well, one of the big ones that is a big sticking point for the InfoSec community is URLs. Well, why does that matter? It's not, if I can think of it two ways. One way I can think of it as, well, there's ad servers all following me around the internet all over the place. And so, sure, people are trying to monetize what websites I go to and why. But think about this from the adversary perspective. Adversary perspective is, oh, now I know exactly what websites you're storing your stuff in. Let's say they were unsuccessful at your master password. That's okay. They can now go to the targeted bank account or the targeted whatever it is that you have put info services on, and they can just start attacking that directly, which is probably, in many average consumer cases, just a username and a password. So maybe you didn't turn 2FA on in that website because maybe they didn't have their game together yet with multi-factor, right? And so now what's turned into my big bad invisible master password is really just, nope, you've given the attacker kind of the blueprint to go find where you are elsewhere on the website and continue their exploits. So to me, that's one big kind of epic fail, is like the for LastPass especially to brag on AES 256 encryption and not use it for all relevant data that you would consider sensitive, to me, is a big miss here. So that's one area of concern. The second area of concern is really talking about the core technology behind, again, how do you store the representation of the master password on disk or in memory? And so there is a cryptographic function standard known as PBKDF2, or password based key derivation function version 2, which you can go read the RFC for if you're so inclined. But put simply, think of it as a modern cryptographic hashing function that is going to compute iterative hashes to make passwords very resistant to brute force attacks, whether that's dictionary attacks or rainbow attacks. So I want to break this down a little bit further. Traditionally, old school web 1.0 stuff, like the traditional, like, don't do this, it's bad, is you have a web server, you have a database server and you store someone's username and password in plain text. Person types in a password in the web form, does a post request to the backend, and hey, if the password matches the password, authenticate them. Well, after folks got really tired of databases constantly being stolen with plain text passwords, people got a little bit smarter. We started using encryption and hashing functions to essentially say, don't store the password, store a hash in the database. What the hash essentially is, it's a one-way function, which means that if I type in my super turbo calculator password 123, that's not what's getting stored in the database. What's getting stored in the database is a unique cryptographic string that can't be reversed. So I can't use that string to rederive the original password. But if I type that exact password into your cryptographic function, it will always produce the same unique hash string. And that's how I know it's, quote, your password. Well, what became the problem with that was that as computers got more powerful, more sophisticated, more breaches happened, hashes by themselves became an easy target, because instead of just doing dictionary attacks, they did something called rainbow tables. And what a rainbow table was is, let's pre-generate a list of hundreds of millions of passwords and what their hashes are. And when a breach happens, I don't need to go brute force and do a bunch of hash math. I just need to see, hey, does this hash in the database exist in my rainbow table? And if it does, tell me what the plain text was that I originally computed from it. So folks said, okay, all right. So that's when things like salting and introducing randomness got involved, so that, the password may be the same, but if you didn't know the salt associated with the hash function, you weren't going to be able to just use a rainbow table against that database unless you had stolen the salt as well. Okay, great. So that's kind of like a classic 101 primer on the evolution of password authentication in Web 1.0, right? Fast forward to password managers and this discussion a little bit. What's going on with the password-based key derivative function is that rather than just stopping at, I put my password into a hash function that has a salt and I'm done, that derivative function takes the output of that first hash and it keeps putting it back into the hash function. And it does this in some cases over 100,000 times before it stores that final hash output value in a database. What does this actually achieve? It slows down the ability it makes you more resistant to dictionary and rainbow attacks, right? It doesn't eliminate them, but it makes it much more resistant because you have to go through all those additional computations for each password or credential you are going to make a guess against. But furthermore, it counteracts the evolution of hardware, right? So something totally tangential to password managers that you wouldn't intuitively think, oh, these things are related, but think about blockchain, right? Like what's running blockchain right now in Bitcoin? GPUs. Why? Because all of a sudden GPUs got really, really good at computing hashes. So yeah, they're really good at running blockchain, but guess what? They're also really good at trying to crack passwords. So as hardware gets more advanced, we need to keep upping the cryptographic standards around hashes. So one of the cool things about PBK DF2 is that while the spec and the standard is a known RFC thing, go read about it, go learn about it, the main configurable is how many iterations or how many times do you want to put that hash back through this function before you spit it out and save the result. And so one of the big kind of black eyes for LastPass here, bringing it all the way back to the breach, is that in their 2018 posture, when they updated to a minimum of 12 characters for the master password, they also updated to a minimum of 100,000 iterations, which is kind of now the standard for many password managers for the KDF function. However, up until 2018, it was only 5,000, which maybe was a big number back then, but not such a big number now, right? What's worse is that as part of this disclosure, it's become evident that many of the folks who, again, account users pre-change in guidance 2018, had KDF iterations as low as 500 in some cases, and they never got migrated to the new standard. And this is not something that a user should have to go in and think about. It should just happen for 100% of your customers. So if you go look at OWASP, which is kind of an InfoSec industry standard for best practices and basic web security, their latest recommendation right now is 310,000 iterations for this function. So just to give you a sense, we're talking about customers out there now with leaked vaults that maybe had as low as 500 iterations. They're going to be way more susceptible to hackers just sitting there with throwing compute at it to crack that master password than if they had just done the right thing and gotten everyone to a higher KDF standard. So that was really the second big aspect of this. And so when you put it all in a bow, it's just the trickle of smoking gun problems with LastPass. So it's not like today all your passwords are out there in the plain text and this is the end of the world. But I think for LastPass as a company, there's a few problems here. 2 breaches in a year, which really it's one breach that they didn't contain, but they chose to break it out as 2 events, which actually made the problem worse, I think, from a public relations standpoint, if nothing else. 2, you have a company that's not leveraging the encryption to encrypt all of the things, which is a miss. 3, you have not so great configuration standards for things like PBKDF2, which, hello, this is a company that focuses on doing nothing but password management. Like, get this right. This is non-negotiable as far as I'm concerned. And so when you add those up in the trickle, and now you can go find things like what the vault format looks like, and you add this up with some of the other kind of vulnerabilities and techniques that an adversary would use to attack you on LastPass, it just, if you're someone that is storing passwords in the cloud through one of these password managers and you're placing your trust in a company like this, for me, this is enough to be like, no, it's time to make a change. So definitely covered in a wide variety of other InfoSec podcasts, news articles, etc. But part of what I wanted to walk through with the LastPass breach was not just, hey, here's what happened and here's why folks are upset, but I also want to make sure that folks are following what are kind of some of the basic foundational things that all password managers should be doing really well that are non-negotiables. And unfortunately, the consumer doesn't always know what the right question is to ask or to be looking for to make sure that their password manager is doing that. And so in the case of LastPass and a lot of the other ones, they publish white papers all day long, and you can go find a white paper for pretty much every password manager online. But really seeing what they say in those papers and what they don't say tells you a lot about where you should be placing your trust.
So Christian, I mean, I'm a longtime LastPass customer. They, like I said, I mean, it's been years since they sponsored the show, and I think I was using it before then. I had I'm not going to say the number, but I had a fairly long password in those days. Thinking about what I need to do now. So of course I've changed that password, right? But did that, if being a old customer, is that enough I'm thinking about in the moment now. I'm thinking like, okay, right now, how do I protect myself? If I'm thinking I got passwords out there, even if I'm going to move, what do I need to do today?
What you just said is one of the big concerns and fallacies of what I think a lot of users are taking away from this, right? They're thinking, oh, LastPass got breached. I just got to update my master password and I'm all set.
Right.
Wrong. Why is it wrong, right? It goes back to what happened. They have an offline copy at their disposal of what your vault looked like cryptographically at the time you used that master password, which means it doesn't matter how many times you rotate your master password now, what they're cracking is what your master password was when the breach took place. So this is a big game over aspect of it, is that in order to, if you want to assume that you're at risk, whether it's because you're a high profile target or whether it's because maybe you're an old LastPass customer and some of these configurations aren't correct, your only recourse is to rotate every single password you care about in that vault, in addition to the master password, to have some level of confidence that if you do eventually get cracked, it's not an issue. And again, this is generalizing a little bit some things around 2FA not being enabled and other things for those individual accounts. But the key takeaway is, my concern is, I'm sure there are a lot of non-technical aware consumers that use these products, read these breaches and think, oh, I'll just go update my master password. And they never think about why that's not an actual mitigation in this case.
Okay. Yeah. So it's smart to change it. That doesn't necessarily fix it, right? From that perspective, in the short term, probably go in there just in case they try to do brute force against that account using the old password. That's taken care of. Turn on 2MFA for sure, just to make sure that's covered, kind of piece. I think most of our listeners probably were beyond that to begin with, right? They probably were doing that. So, but it is a little bit, I mean, from a, you did an inventory and got a certain number. I did an inventory, got a certain number, and that number's a lot. Like
a lot.
And I use the notes functionality in that quite a bit to store some sensitive things that I don't necessarily want out in the clear, in their notes. It was the notes feature one of the encrypted or not?
Fortunately,
Encrypted?
yes. You would
Okay.
think people who brand things called secure notes would like actually encrypt that field.
Okay.
So
Good.
that would have been a game over, right? That would have been a mass exodus. I think they may still have an exodus of some kind, but that would have been definitely a step worse.
Yeah, I can't imagine. Tony said he went through and changed all of his passwords, and ironically I had been going through and using the security function to say, hey, where do I have similar passwords, right? And I still had some, I kind of have a throwaway password that I use that then I change right after I open it up. And so I'd been going through doing all those, and that got what me thinking. I'm like, oh man, I've got a lot. I got in it. It's, I mean, it's a weekend. It's probably, but it's probably worth. Yeah, it's probably worth the. When you think about making a change, we're going to talk about some specific. Well, anything else before we shift gears a little bit? Anything else from a LastPass side of things that you want to cover?
Not specifically with LastPass. I would say there are some other tangential aspects to what I think folks have learned about LastPass that make you think more broadly about, we'll just say, password managers at large. I think one of the big ones for me is when you talk about customers who want their passwords in the cloud versus only in local storage and or somewhere in between. I know it's been a very hot topic on this show. I know it's a hot topic elsewhere, but some of the things that makes folks like myself squeamish is thinking about how, again, even if you have all of this great encryption cryptographic setup for your passwords, web security still plays a huge role in the overall assurance of whether or not you have a good solution. And so one of the areas that maybe we'll get into a little bit on the show is just, there are other risks associated with using this type of software that a lot of people overlook. I think one of the biggest ones that get overlooked is autofill, right? It's one of the best convenience, ease of use features. That is why folks use these capabilities. And so what's the classic story? Well, the classic story is you install this password extension in your browser. It's on your iPad, it's on your iPhone, whatever, and it's unlocked for a period of time. So let's say you choose to unlock it for 3 hours at a time, and you want to go to website ABC and have it autofilled. Well, you better hope that website ABC didn't have someone, cross-site script or drop a little JavaScript sidecar into loading into your browser, because all they have to do is craft that client-side script to try and hit and use your open running instance to echo back your password because your vault's open, your encryption's there. So did they have to crack your encryption? No. All they had to do is take advantage of a web exploit and the fact that you do autofill, and bam, the credential's gone. And so there are some of those considerations that I think a lot of the average consumers of these products aren't thinking of. And so I really don't necessarily think anyone is being too paranoid when they make the decision to be a local only password vault. Now, what I'll talk about as we get into migration strategies and alternatives, there's actually a middle ground. And it's particularly a nice benefit of Bitwarden, which was one of the main reasons why I made the switch. But I'll talk a little bit about kind of what's the middle ground between tinfoiling your passwords into local only vaults and saying, I'm going to go to general purpose cloud password managers, and we'll pivot there. But I think we'll at least wrap the LastPass portion of this segment.
Let me take a few questions from chat because I think there's some good ones out there. Tony asks, so is it reasonable? I mean, we'll end it with this part. Is it reasonable to stay with LastPass at all? Is there any conditions you'd stay for?
Consumers have choice. It's a big market. There's a lot of options out there. If you follow the guidance to clean up after this incident, is there any residual damage to you? Probably not. But is there an inherent reason or thing that's compelling you to continue to do business with them? I'd also argue probably not. So I think it's a consumer choice at this point. Customers have had reduced trust as a result of this event, and I think it's gonna, for some InfoSec people, these are non-negotiables. It's I'm out. This, never again. I think for other folks, it's gonna be okay. It is what it is. I've rotated the passwords I care about, and I'm moving on. But the cost or the time to do a migration is going to be more than what it's worth to me, and so they'll stay with LastPass. And then there'll be folks in the middle kind of listening, reading the articles, and trying to read the tea leaves to decide, is it time to, double down or jump ship. So I don't know that I have a strong conviction for the consumer on this one, but I can certainly say from an InfoSec perspective and from a just educated buyer perspective, there's a lot of options out there. And if you're willing to try something different and you're willing to learn a different platform, and find something that's ease of use, I think there's no reason not to give that a try.
If I acted like with LastPass, if I acted and I went through every single account and changed the passwords, they make that kind of easy in some regards. They've got some automatic ones that go in there and do that for you. I use it as an opportunity to update 2FA on sites that support it, make sure that's working and turned on if it's not already done. Is that mitigation enough? In other words, since I've changed everything, including my master password on that platform, have I mitigated it, at least for now, taking out the trust for the company and knowing that not everything is encrypted and some of those kinds of things? Is that enough? Or could it be enough?
I think it could for some, right? Especially if smaller vaults, maybe you care about the banks most, then maybe you care about email the next most. And then after that, it's like, here's these 1 or 2 websites I haven't logged into in 3 years, probably not a big deal. Yeah, if you go turn on 2FA and some of the places you really care about, you've probably done a fair bit of mitigation exercise on the cheap. But again, it's a risk calculation at that point. And so I think everyone's risk tolerance is going to be different.
If I am one of those old accounts and I have the small iteration number, is there a way to change that? Is there, so that I can have the high number on my account? I'm still a little not totally clear on how that works, and that's okay. But is there a way for me to change that on LastPass today?
So I don't know if LastPass offers a configurable for it, or if it just shows you what you're at, and if there's a magic button to upgrade you to the next number. One of the things that's really cool about Bitwarden is that you can set exactly the number of iterations that you want for your KDF function. So if you want to go up to the OWASP standard, go right ahead, set it to 310,000 iterations. If you want to be at 100,000, which will be a little bit more performant on mobile devices, go for it, right? So they give you the freedom and choice there. I would not be surprised if LastPass also does this now, to be clear, but as someone who is not a LastPass user, I would have to include that in the show notes.
I think Jim Shoemaker says you absolutely can change that count. Does it matter, Jim, and put in chat where that's available on the site? Would it matter if I did, let's just say 1,000? Is 1,001 any different? Should I make it a weird number?
No,
That was a
putting a
question from
randomness in the
earlier.
number has no cryptographic value whatsoever, right? So it's really an order of magnitude thing that we're talking about here. So I recommend that no customer run below 100,000 iterations. Anything you want to do above that, all the more power to you.
Bob asks a good question. He says, how does one actually know when they've been successful? I think he's talking about the hackers being successful. How do you know when that ABC 123 or whatever is there like how do they know they've cracked it? They've, say they've got, I have a address, a super secure location address in my secure notes. How do they know they've gotten something out of that? Or what if I stored Bitcoin hashes in there that are random, crazy? How are they going to know that from anything else?
Yeah. So, I mean, going back to the concept of hash functions, right? It's not, does the hash function look close? It has to be exactly correct because it's a unique function for what that plain text password is. So for the hacker, all they have to know is, let's just talk about the case of the rainbow attack, right? If I know that this rainbow table value of the hash function equals exactly what is stored there, I know what my plain text is, I'm done. If I don't know that, then I'm putting the best brute force method that I can to cryptographically attack and try to derive what the master password is by generating a whole lot of hashes from my plain text guesses and seeing, does that hash match what's getting stored here? Now, in the case of the KDF function, it's not just doing that once. You have to line up and match the number of KDF iterations that were used with the hash function and the password that you're attempting. So that's another thing, is like, if the attacker doesn't know what KDF iterations were used in the configuration, now that's also harder, right? Because now they have to compare every hash they compute for every plain text that they attempt at every iteration interval they want to assert on, which means they are spending exponentially more time per password that they guess than if KDF isn't in place at a high iteration count.
What about a hybrid approach? We're going to talk about RoboForm here in just a second, but what about a hybrid approach? In other words, splitting that attack surface up across some of these, maybe using some of them that are really good at one thing, but maybe not good at another, and taking advantage of their strengths. And from that standpoint, is there any value, just as I think through this, to maybe dividing, if I'm going to change things over the course of a weekend or two, would I be smart to maybe look at a couple different platforms and maybe pick 2 or 3 to use?
I don't think it hurts from a becoming an educated consumer and finding the thing that works best for you. I do think there is an inherent complexity in having to maintain multiple password managers and decide which one to use for what when, and remembering what was stored in which password manager. I think there's also a convenience factor that's tricky there, right? For example, if both password managers have autofill enabled, it's kind of a race condition, right? Who's going to autofill what when, and is it going to work out? And
True.
maybe that doesn't happen if both password managers aren't storing the same credential, but just getting compatibility that the extensions play nicely together in the browser at the same time is probably not a foregone conclusion. So I'm not a huge fan of the hybrid model for this. I think it's definitely makes sense to kind of comparison shop and kick the tires on a few. But once you kind of find the one that works right for you and has good security principles, I kind of recommend going one direction
Okay.
long term.
We should talk about this every week because the chat room is never as active as it is right now. If you're listening to this on the podcast and you want to go back, lots of great stuff. I can't cover it all in the chat. If you want to go back, catch the live version, the Average Guy TV on YouTube. Come to the live version, you can see the chat. Lots of great chat going on. Would I give it away if I told how many password iterations I had on my LastPass account? Would that be if somebody knew that number, would that be a bad thing? If they knew my name, got to my account, knew the number of iterations, would that give things away?
It's not great, but it's
Okay.
not like you're giving the farm away either.
Yeah.
I think again, so yeah, so some folks may be like, well, if it's not exactly 100,000, but I do 100,001, is that going to get them? Well, probably not, because they're just going to try every sequential iteration, and so
Yeah.
really, it's
Yeah.
not like they're just shooting in the dark and then moving on to the next plain text. But so I think it's giving away the farm? No. I think all aspects, though, of configuration of cryptography should not be known to the adversary in an ideal setup. The attacker should be able to know and understand the algorithm, and even reading and understanding the algorithm, they should never be able to compromise the integrity and confidentiality of your data. And in order to do that, protecting configurables, what do I mean by configurables? Something like the KDF, something like what the salt is. Those are really important things, right? Because when those configurables become exposed, it reduces the effectiveness and narrows the attack surface that the adversary is concerned with when it comes to cracking the password.
Bob is encouraging me to say it and then just change it. It's a high number. I'm just going to leave it at that. I was is when you opened the show and you started talking about this. I mean, this was a real learning thing for me. I'm like, oh, like I'm an old customer, and like, who knows? Now I've been using a fairly long password for a while, but who knows how many iterations there were on there?
Yeah.
And so, Jim Shoemaker, thanks for helping me find that. That is if you're in LastPass, let me go back. I will show this on screen. Let's see if I can find his instructions again. There is a way to do it, but Christian, it was a concern of mine. All of a sudden, here it is. If you're a LastPass user, go to the vault, account settings, general, advanced settings, password iterations. It's a ways down on that list, and you can see the iterations. That's the right spot, right, Christian? That's what you're talking about on that. Okay. Mine was a fairly large number, so I feel pretty good about that. You had, you've talked about RoboForm for a long time. You did a little looking into that as well. What did you discover there?
I got smart, and the smarter I got, the sadder I got. Unfortunately, I think that's how life goes sometimes, right? The smarter you get, the harder it falls. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so with RoboForm, there's kind of some interesting things going on. One of the first things I would say is get to know your company. What do I mean by that? Get to know who owns the product, who develops the product, what their team is, where they're staffed out of, where their backgrounds are. And I would say, in the case of RoboForm, not really a pretty unique shop, the way they're set up, who their customers are, how they got started. Pretty unique backgrounds there, right? And if you compare it to something like LastPass, very different level of scope of size of the company, the revenue that they were doing, what kind of customer base they served, et cetera. So that gives you a little bit of spidey senses kind of right there. But I think one of the big things that attracted folks to RoboForm is that they were one of the probably biggest names that resisted forcing users to go to password sync everywhere. They always gave their customers the ability for kind of local storage, local vault only. And for most of the other big names like LastPass, it was, sync everywhere, go to the cloud subscription model. That was the name of the game, right? So if you're looking for something that was kind of the options there if I want it, but if I don't want it, I can stay local only. RoboForm didn't appear to be a bad option for quite some time for that reason. But like all things, there are some things that start to give you pause. Certainly, kind of doing some research on the company and how it's structured in its background, one area of pause for me. Another area of pause is you can go find this wonderful case study on RoboForm from 2014 on how secure is RoboForm, and it's kind of this 5-minute challenge write up that Paul Reviews did, which is a great write up, and it talks through kind of two big issues that were found with RoboForm at that time. One was for their online Web Vault version back again in circa 2014, total violation of zero knowledge encryption going on here, right? So the password is ending up going to the server. The server is doing decryption in these cases. Demonstrations of plain text password in the web form. Like these are pretty big red flag type concerns around representations for some of their products. Another big red flag was they demonstrated the ability to bypass the pin unlock feature on the Android version of the app so that you didn't even need to type in your master password on your phone to read from the vault. You could just alter a configuration setting in the thing and it bypassed all of that setup to have you start reading content out of the vault, which was like okay, that's pretty much a red flag stop, foul on the play type moment. So there's enough data with a variety and a lot of these. I mean, so today it's LastPass, right? But a lot of these folks, as fairly saturated market now, lots of fish, different size ecosystems. But for a lot of them, for a long time, in order to have the secret sauce and make a company out of it and do the whole sales, PR, marketing, there wasn't a concept of, oh yeah, we're going to give you the source code for how we use our product, right? And this is one of the key features that wins me over time and time again about why I now choose Bitwarden over a lot of the competition, because you look at how they got founded, where they're based, how they got their funding, who in the research community has validated them, and how. One of the big things you realize is that Bitwarden is fully open source. So they're both a for-profit company. They have premium models and features. They do licensing that's based off of, they have their own mechanism for doing, they have digitally signed license files. Like, so even though the source code is right there and you can go read how it works, like all fully open source, it's still a paid product. And this is huge from an InfoSec perspective, because now I don't have to trust a white paper or I don't have to take a company's word for it. If I'm an information security enthusiast or subject matter expert, I can go validate for myself whether or not I feel their implementation is correct. What's furthermore really cool about this is that it's not just the client that they're giving you the source code for. One of the second winning features for Bitwarden for me that almost no one else is doing right now is the ability to self-host the equivalent of Bitwarden Cloud or LastPass Cloud, right? So if you want to sync everywhere, but you don't trust a centralized server with a name that everyone knows where they're going to go try and hit up your credentials or do a JavaScript attack against that DNS name, great, no problem. If you still want the syncing features and device everywhere, self-host the Bitwarden server in an environment of your choosing. Pick the DNS name of your choosing that's going to be random and non-obvious so that a JavaScript attack can't easily take advantage of you, right? So for me, right then and there, the fact that it was open source and could be verified independently by security experts, and two, had that self-hosting option, which to me is really the first conversation around a hybrid option between all local vault storage and giving over control to a cloud storage model by that password company. Those really vaulted Bitwarden ahead of a lot of other options that are on the market right now.
Christian, I host with Maple Grove Partners. You've been a great partner to the Average Guy TV for a lot of years. It's the reason it actually exists. So are you saying could I put it somewhere, since I host with you, could I put it somewhere there that's fairly obscure? I mean, even creating a path that's fairly obscure so that it's not, it's not in some obvious location, and then be able to sync, be able from anywhere, phone, home, work, those kinds of things, to be able to get that done. Is that something that would work very easily if I hosted at Maple Grove
Yeah,
Partners?
right on. So whether you choose to come host it with us at Maple Grove or another host of your choosing, or you self-host in your own environment, yeah, this is a client web server application. You can set up a DNS name, you can get it, what's great is because it's the same exact source code, it's not like learning the self-hosted Bitwarden versus the like online Bitwarden. Like it is the same exact thing as when you go and use the managed version of Bitwarden. And remember, like the key here is like if you exist on the web, it's not like it's invisible. It's not like it's the dark web. It's not like it's completely off the grid. If someone really wants to go digging, they're probably going to be able to find some clues as to where you might be. But one, it's going to defeat a lot of average kind of script kiddie type stuff. And two, it is still important to remember that the ultimate security of these things is going to be that master password complexity and following the right cryptographic best practices. But I absolutely think self-hosting the server is giving folks a real world option that aren't quite comfortable being all in one camp, are still kind of sad that they're only local and that they have to, go log onto the desktop to then get the password to then go put it in the phone. And so I'm a big fan of the self-hosted option because it is that hybrid approach that I think a lot of customers are looking for.
The non-hosted option or the non-synced option oftentimes leads us to choose poor passwords because it's like, okay, I need these kind of things to be the same because it's just too much work for me to go find them, to get them, to whatever. Do you think that security through obscurity, that in the sense of self-hosting, is that better than the chance that you get lazy with your passwords and they may not be as strong as they could be if you picked, because I'm sure Bitwarden's got the ability to just generate something random for me, 25. I
Yep.
mean, in most cases I say, how many can you take? And then I just make it that number, right? So that I'm getting the absolute longest password possible. It better, worse, thinking in the sense of it's probably better to have in this case, have the convenience so you create long passwords than maybe to get stuck in an area of inconvenience so you're creating less secure passwords. I don't know. Thoughts
Right.
on
I
that?
mean, and a great example of that, right, is like, well, is it more secure to write sticky notes of your passwords and put them all over your monitor so that when your EA walks by your computer screen, she can write down, she can use all the passwords that, so it's like, where is the opportunity threat environment, right? And why I would argue security through obscurity isn't security because it's not.
Yeah.
And that, you got to follow the cryptographic best practices first and foremost every single time. I don't see the self-hosted option as security through obscurity outright, but it gives you a lot of flexibility. So, for example, Justin brings up a great point in chat, and it's one that a lot of folks are doing is maybe you want to be able to sync, but you're still super skittish. You don't want to put the self-hosted server fully out on the public World Wide Web. So what do? You can run that server and run it on a VPN. And as long as all your devices that you want to sync can connect onto that VPN tunnel, now you have multiple layers of cryptography going on, right? You have the cryptographic tunnel to go from the World Wide Web to your intranet. Then you have the cryptography of doing application level TLS security to talk to the web server. Then you have the cryptography of zero knowledge master password, then decrypting something that's sitting at rest. So it adds this kind of third layer of protection that really would be a very desirable option for the uber paranoid. And VPN technology is dime a dozen. It's super cheap. It's very easy to deploy for the consumer. My experience setting up Bitwarden server, pretty simple. I mean, it's not going to be something that someone with at least basic knowledge of Linux is going to tackle. But it wasn't like I had to spend 5 days deciphering the instructions and finding the missing things and adjusting a bunch of things to match their environment. I mean, it really was, once you stand up the server and you're ready to do the Bitwarden install, it was about, honestly, 10-15 minutes to do the actual core, get Bitwarden server running in a happy way. So pretty much everything else you want to do around that is also fairly cheap to add that additional level of assurance, if that's something you're interested in.
Christian, our friends who they're not going to do these things that we're talking about. LastPass was a nice option because it just worked for the average person. Bitwarden, same, like, can you recommend it the same way to individuals and say, yeah, they'll host it and sync it and it's worth the change?
I can, because in the least technical savvy consumer base, it's really not that much different from LastPass, right? You go to bitwarden.com instead of lastpass.com. It's the same kind of web login experience and capability. The types of features you're going to see are very similar. So some of the features I really like that I think LastPass probably by and large does as well. The autofill is excellent on Bitwarden. I mean, it was really great. One of the things I also really liked about it was, and especially coming from RoboForm, and not doing the cloud-based version of RoboForm to this, was the ability to set up time-based one-time passwords and set that up directly in the Bitwarden app. I was able to get rid of Duo Mobile completely. I never have to look at my phone again now for Authenticator or Duo or the code. Like, I'm done with all of that, right? And so what's really cool is not only is Bitwarden acting as my 2FA for websites, but with the autofill, it'll put that code right into your clipboard. So all you have to do is Control V the token code into the form, which, by the way, super smart too, because yet another way to defeat some clever types of client-side attacks when you have to still paste it, but it's in your Windows buffer, which is at a higher privilege level than your browser. Like, lots of little clever stuff there, right? But wicked easy to use autofill, and lots of great security features, right? So their reporting feature has one for exposed passwords, reused passwords, weak passwords, unsecure website utilization, inactive use of multi-factor, and breached accounts that your emails are discovered in. And that's all on top on, if you're really paranoid and you still want to use the managed thing, you're not really interested in self-hosting, and you're just worried that somehow your master password is not cryptographically enough secure, you can enable two-step login on your master password. So it supports Authenticator, YubiKey, Duo, Fido, email. So, like, for me, I really see that there's something for everyone in something like Bitwarden, but foundationally, if you want to use it as a kind of, hey, I'm coming from LastPass, I need to migrate because I just have decided I'm done with LastPass, but I'm not really ready to get consumed into all of the enthusiast features. Like, to me, you can configure Bitwarden to match the personality of the consumer, which is really awesome.
Yeah, I like the idea of having you host it for me,
Yeah.
and then build it from there. If I was going to move, and there's some ways to migrate. I think that you can export out of one and import into the other. Is that really a best practice, or should I sit down with LastPass going password site by site, note by note? Might be a good time to clean some things out too, and move them one by one, changing them as I move them, so that I know I got them all. Which would you recommend? Export, import, get it done quicker, or maybe I'm missing an option?
It's my option is option C, which is a weird merging of options A and B, right? So for me, I do think export import is the way to go from a not only a convenience factor, but making sure you actually migrated all the things before you blow away the old environment, right? So you didn't like have the human error of, oh, I skipped over one, oops. But the thing to remember about export import that like people need to like sear in their brain, right? When you export, all of these tools export to CSV, comma separated value, plain text. So when it's sitting on your hard disk, it's plain text, which means when you finish importing to that new tool, you need to make sure you have deleted that file. Do not let it sit on your hard drive, because otherwise, what's the point of having a password manager, right? Like, it violates the first tenet of what we're trying to do here. So I do think export import is the right thing for consumers, but you must be paying attention and delete that export when you're done so that your passwords are properly protected. So that's step one. Step two, once you're imported into the new tool, I do absolutely recommend doing a top down. It's painful. It's going to take a day. Just get over it. But I think it's worth it. If you care about not having to worry about breaches and getting owned in the whole 9 yards, I think it's worth sitting down for 8 hours and starting at the top and have it autofill login with what you're using today. Go do the change password. And that way you're migrating to the next version all in the new software. You're learning how the new software works, and it's just getting all saved and set up right there. Then let's say as part of that rotation, you want to turn on 2FA. Well, great. You're already in the new environment. So I recommend that is kind of the move sequence. The export import part of it, if you do it right, again, takes about 15 minutes and you're up and running in the new software. It's really a no frills thing. Getting the Bitwarden plugin set up, same thing. I mean, it was about 10 minutes for me to set up the plugin in my browser, get it configured and tuned up the way I wanted, and have the settings set up. Very easy to use. The longest part of a migration, I think, is if you want to do it right, you should go through your assets and do those rotations and do those cleanups. And so, again, you can also choose to kind of take a risk calculus approach of like, okay, I'm going to focus on the things that matter to me most, my bank accounts, my emails, my medical accounts, whatever, and then maybe do them in batches so that you're like not falling asleep at the keyboard. But I definitely recommend that the strategy is get to the new thing as soon as possible, blow away the old stuff behind you with great certainty, and then get on with rotating.
Well, every time I change a password, I do that kind of anyways. As you go through, change it, make sure it's the new information has gotten there, and then sign out. Try to sign back in with the new stuff just to make sure I got it all. What about okay? So I used LastPass Authenticator because I got the backup. I mean, it backs up nicely with my account and some of those other kind of things. Where do I go from? Where do I go now? If I'm going to leave them, first of all, is that part of the breach? We haven't really even talked about that. You know, the Authenticator app on your phone. Is that part of the breach?
None of those apps are part of the breach, and many of them, for example, like Duo, they're not connected apps. They don't have to connect or do anything. They basically take advantage of that QR code or that one-time secret you put in to basically synchronize based on time and generate a value that can only be correct for that login sequence. And so, those apps are not part of the concern space here. But what you end up doing is, let's say you're already using the Authenticator app or one of these other apps. What you'll have to do is you'll log into that service with your current password, with the whatever app you're using. You'll unenroll from MFA for that account, and then you'll re-enroll into MFA using the Bitwarden time-based OTP. And then at that point, you can remove it from Authenticator or Duo because it's all just going to be self-integrated into Bitwarden at that point.
Oh, okay.
And so again, another great optimization where I don't have to have multiple ecosystems to do login. It's not like, oh crap, I don't have my phone. Let me go get the Duo mobile app out. Like, no, that's done now, right? I can have 2FA security on the cheap without having to have my phone around.
And that's just as secure?
Yeah. Yeah, it's the same. I mean, there's really two types of OTPs. There's time-based, and I'm going to skewer myself, HOTP, which I always forget. Hash-based, yeah, thank you. And so they're slightly different. They're both cryptographically secure, and the Bitwarden implementation is just as good as any good old average TOTP implementation. So
Yeah, I'm so used to going to my phone for two-factor on
it
some
was
of
one of
those,
the biggest,
you know.
most enjoyable things about migrating to Bitwarden was that
Hmm.
one feature. Yeah.
Okay. I'll have to try it out. I'll have to try because I probably won't. I mean, I'll probably want to get in there and give it a try. I could probably use their web version to start with and try a few accounts and see what I like. See how it works. Do some things that are low for me, that are just kind of low quality. Be able to get it done. Okay, we're going on, but last thing I want to ask you about is, I thought, can't we be done with passwords? Like, it's 2023.
2023.
Why are we
It's
still talking
shocking.
about passwords? Like,
Yeah, it really is amazing, isn't it? I laugh. It's going to be like in the description of this podcast. Like, it feels insane to me that we're talking about password managers as this hot thing in 2023. Here we are. Um, yeah. I think what's been commonplace in the industry over the last few years is the phrase something you have, something you know. Something you have is that multi-factor, something you know seems to be passwords, but you've seen a lot of movement from the something you know being a conventional password to being something more akin to like a PIN, right? Like when you roll up to the ATM to get money out, you're not entering a password, you're putting a 4-digit PIN. Why? Because there's something you have, this nice credit card or debit card that has all the features right there as the something that you have. And so I think the next switch that hasn't quite happened yet outside of enterprise into general consumer is forcing on people by default the option of, hey, give us a PIN and you must have MFA. And then your login is a combination of your PIN and your code sequence, whether that's a token, whether that's a thing you're reading, whether that's a haptic, it doesn't really matter. PIN being the something you know is, as you can see, the banking industry probably has adopted it longer for almost anyone else in the enterprise. It's worked quite well. And so I think the more the industry just pushes, here are 50 bajillion different ways to do MFA for free, and these companies start saying, okay, by default, we're doing this. I don't know what it's going to take them to say, you just can't do a password anymore. It's just MFA or it's nothing. Unfortunately, um, it feels like there needs to be some type of forcing function so that once that is the thing, the password manager becomes way less about storing the secret and hopefully way more about the other features like the autofill, where you go to, generation of that MFA, etc. And they should never have a need to store your PIN unless you want different PINs across all your sites, which maybe you do. It's not a bad best practice, right? But uh, it's shocking. And you get into some of the other things, why aren't we doing things like biometrics or fingerprints or other things? I just don't think the cost is there yet for the average consumer. Sure, for your phone or something to do something like Face ID, I think that's a great middle ground, but I don't think we're at the point where biometrics are at the same level of assurance and foolproofness at the consumer level compared to what these MFA capabilities can do. So I think something you have should be the bar for quite some time. But I think the discussion needs to move away from passwords being the something that you know. And that's where we're not at, apparently, 10 years later.
Yeah. It's just crazy. I'm just like, come on, guys. We can, and why can't with biometrics? Why can't it be two things? Why couldn't it be both face and fingerprint? I think sometimes we think it's got to be one. If I've got my phone, I mean, the Android, one of the versions used, it had the fingerprint thing behind it. Why can't you use both? Why couldn't we have a voice print functionality that you use both facial and voice? Some of those kinds of things where I always feel like we've got to get to that one thing. And why couldn't it be a combination of a bunch of easy things, pin, face, finger, boom, you're in, right? Type deal. Those would all be easy to do and hard to replicate. Don't you think?
Yeah. I mean, certainly the more factors involved, the lower the risk. Consumer ease of use, I'm sure, is really a big factor in all of that. And not all hardware ecosystems and not all ecosystems play the same and have the same level of capability and compute, which makes it difficult. But yeah.
Well, and not all areas of the world where everybody has the ability to have all those things, and yet they still want to do business in those areas. And so you're playing to a least common denominator. And right now, a password is fairly free, right? I mean, from a implementation standpoint of what the consumer can generate. I love your idea of a pin. I love your idea. I like a 6-digit pin because those are pretty easy. They're a little more complex than 4, but a little easier to remember. And then that was something else. A pin and a thumb, a fingerprint, a pin and a face ID. Microsoft's doing that pretty well on Windows, and for if you turn that on and configure it that way, and that seems to be a pretty secure way of getting in there. I don't have to use a password for a lot of those things anymore. We're using a 6-digit and and face, which is pretty cool. Christian, would you add anything else? Did we miss anything as you're looking at the notes? You did a great job of covering those, but anything I missed or any final thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think looking at this, we have pretty good coverage. So I'm going to say that's a wrap.
Yeah, no, I feel pretty good about it. I think you've given me a good plan of attack on this. I think I'm going to give Bitwarden a look. Say, okay, is this gonna work for me? I think I'm personally gonna make a account by account conversion. I want to go through and see what they've got. I'm gonna make that. I'll be honest with you, I'm not comfortable with a CSV file with everything on it sitting on my hard drive. That's me, right? If you feel okay doing that, I think you can get that done. And then I think I think if I like it, I think I may go with an option with you. And I think others probably, for folks that are hosting with you, that could be something you could work with them on to get set up if they're already hosting. And if they're not hosting, you still have plans for $10 that they could
$10 a month
host something else. And this, is that a pretty easy setup for you to get an instance rolling, like to get a Bitwarden instance rolling for me? Is that a pretty easy setup, or
yeah, I'd like to get it to the point where I just have a pre-canned deployment instance, but to get a VM up that runs the basic application and keeps it up to date, pretty straightforward.
Yeah, that's super cool. And Tony says, hey, it's free to try. So give it a try. So I think I'm actually kind of, as I think about going through and cleaning up. I mean, when I went through to check for weak passwords the last time I did this, I deleted a whole bunch of accounts. And I'm like, yeah, I'm not using this thing anymore. There was a time I was trying a whole bunch of different stuff. And I'm like, yeah, we're not doing this anymore. I had a bunch of intern accounts that we had created back when you and others were interns at Gallup. And I was like, yeah, we're not using these 2014 accounts anymore. They should probably be deactivated, right? So they're not just sitting out there. I think it's more than just stop using them. I think if you created this Google account 7 years ago and you're just not using it, you should really deactivate it, right? Not let it just sit there. Maybe eventually Google will come through and clean it up and deactivate it themselves. but it's probably a good idea, right, to go through and deactivate those.
If you're not using it, deactivate it.
Yeah, get it done. All right. Well, Christian, thanks for coming on, and thanks for being a part of this, and thanks for being a great member of the community and helping us out. It's actually been super helpful because I was on the fence a little bit. Jim Shoemaker, before he left, was like, "Yeah, I don't think I'm going to leave," and that's okay, right? You have to. I think you have to determine your own, your own threat profile, your own footprint. What are you comfortable with? There are some things that I know that that I'd put in LastPass that I'm like, oh boy, okay, I'm not comfortable thinking that those could be at risk. I'm going to need to change them, and I'm going to need to move them, and I'm going to have to do that here pretty quick. So, good conversation. A couple reminders if you want to join us. And Christian's out there in our Discord group. He's a pretty busy guy, so it's not like he's just chatting all the time, but if you want to get out there on Discord, theaverageguy.tv/Discord, join that group. Super, fairly small, but fairly mighty. So some great conversations. There was a whole Cloudflare and tunneling conversation that went on. I'll be honest, I had no idea what they were talking about. So it can be as simple as barbecue, beer, and bourbon, or it can be as complex as Cloudflare tunneling and some of those other kind of things. Join us in the Discord group, theaverageguy.tv/Discord. If you want to join on Patreon, theaverageguy.tv/Patreon, you can do that. I'm doing my taxes right now, Christian. It's tax time here, right in the U.S. And I was thinking, oh, it's another year. I better go to Patreon. I've got some claiming to do, and so you can. There's another thing to keep in, another password manager thing. I would always lose my tax software password. Maybe that's a good thing. I didn't even know what it was, and then I'd have to go reset it every year. And same this year. You can join us live every Thursday, 8 p.m. Central, 9 Eastern, out here at theaverageguy.tv live. Big thanks to everyone who joined in the chat. Lots of chat conversation, especially early. If you're a podcast listener, I usually say come out to the video to, like, if we're doing demonstrations and stuff. Not the case for this one, but for the chat, that may be an interesting use case to come out to the live. So go to YouTube, search The Average Guy TV, and you'll see the live page. Everything we do live goes there first, and then I edit it, move it over to my YouTube account, Jim Collison on YouTube. I think it's just youtube.com/Jim Collison, get you out there. But those are the edited versions. If you want to catch this live one, because the chat room does not migrate over to the edited version, and you want to follow along in the chat, I think this one would be worth it to come over. And yes, John, it's tax time. Change your tax software password. Get that done. And so you can catch the chat on that, and I think you'll learn a few things from it as well. We'll be back next week, and I don't have the list up on who's on next week. Oh, I know who's on. Bob and Ryan are coming back. They'll have a CES update from all the things that are CES. Christian, did you follow CES at all this year? Things going on?
Not terribly, but there was the whole, emotional car that BMW did, and a couple of weird things here and there, but not too much this year.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Some good stuff. There's some amazing things coming out. Don't forget, for this show also, Christian wrote some really good show notes. So head out to theaverageguy.tv / if you're listening live, this won't work yet, but / HGG559. And you can get his pretty awesome. He does a nice job. He really does write world-class show notes. So when I say that, I'm only thinking of Christian doing that. Thanks for coming out. If you listen live, with that, we'll say goodbye, everybody.
Good night, everyone.
All right, man. Thanks a ton. Any chat room? Any questions? You got a minute? Can you stay around?
Yep,
for just a minute? Chat room. Any questions that Christian? We had a ton, and I didn't get to them. Anything you wanted to ask Christian here that I didn't necessarily answer? Let me go back through here. I could host Bitwarden on like Unraid or like Synology. I could do that.
Honestly, anything that talks, they have both Linux and Windows. So, I mean, pick your poison.
If you wanted to do it that way. I'm intrigued by this other form of two-factor that you were not the phone-based authenticator, but What's the other? What's the?
The HMAC based one, but they're haptic. So like a YubiKey, for example, you just
Okay.
tap it and it generates a one-time password. So here's an example of the this is what Google's looks like, for example.
So I need to get one of those. If I was going to use that, I need to get one of those.
Yeah, so this is like a haptic based hardware token. You depress it for, a couple seconds and it'll generate the staple.
Because it's something you have, right? That's
something you have. Yeah.
something you have.
Here's another one. This is YubiKey's implementation. So again, another type of hardware-based non-read the code token. You give a nice haptic press there, you'll get a token. So yeah, they're pretty cool.
John says, if I self-host, will I need a family account to get an organizational certificate?
Organizational certificate license, maybe. So they have kind of two options after the free. You can pay $10 a year to have 2 users on the self-hosted with all the premium features, and then it's, I think, $60 a year to have 6 family members as an organization. And then once you have the organization, it allows you to do other cool things, like you can share passwords with other people in the organization, or like share aspects of your vaults, or you can send them like private secure notes. So you have to go up. The $10 a year will not get you access to those features. You have to go straight up to the family plan for 60 a year to get one organization loaded in the Bitwarden. So I myself started with the 2 user for $10 a year. I'll see how that goes. But it's both are comparatively cheap for what it offers. So was pretty happy with the pricing.
Tony said he had an issue with the Bitwarden was syncing password changes between devices, which was a pretty big deal.
I wonder if the issue, Anthony, was were you actually having an issue getting syncing to work, or was the issue the thought or concept of doing syncing itself?
Michael, I'm not sure what you mean by this, but how does Norton fit into all of this? I'm sure. Are you thinking like does Norton have a password manager? I know Bitdefender does.
Yeah, they all merged together, didn't they? They have one now called My Norton Password Manager, I think, and I have not used it. So that would be a good one to add to the punch list for evaluation. But that's just if you go to my.norton.com, you can see their password manager. I mean, certainly as a company, they're not going to be open source like Bitwarden is, right? So to me, that's an easy discriminator to call out there. Whether or not they're secure or insecure. Here's one from 2 days ago. Hackers target Norton Password Manager and access 8,000 user accounts. The hackers used automated attempts to guess the passwords. Norton's parent company says they have secured over 925,000 accounts against the attacks. So it's definitely a newer, smaller, fangled thing, I think. I don't know that it would be my first choice, but maybe they have skin in the game.
Tony says it wasn't reliably syncing changes across the devices.
So there's a key there with Bitwarden. You can configure the time interval for syncing, and if you're having issues with the syncing, you can always go and hit the sync button yourself to force it. But what I realized is that it's kind of 2 places, right? It's not just syncing where you're trying to get the change to. You have to make sure the source end that made the change also has frequent syncing intervals. So if you get to fast sync intervals on both the client and on both clients that you're trying to deal with, you should be okay. I did notice that a little bit when I was testing things from a couple different places, but I wouldn't be surprised if that was maybe the same issue or experience. But yeah, be interested to see what version of Bitwarden you were using and kind of what some of the networks and device models you were working with. But once I adjusted the sync timeout configuration, I didn't see any further issues.
LastPass had some interesting security features like country restrictions, prohibit logins from Tor networks. Um, let's see what else. There was another one in here because I was looking for that sync setting because
Hmm.
I noticed too in LastPass I would create an account on the PC and it would take a while for it to get on the phone, that update. And I thought, oh, maybe there's a sync setting in LastPass that I didn't have right. But as far as does Bitwarden have some country, like, look, it should only work in the United States. Like, I'm never leaving the country. If it's hitting it from Russia, it's probably a problem. Are there those features available?
Built within the app itself, no. But what's really great is that if you're self-hosting, right? Let's say you're fronting it with Apache web server as the proxy, just set up your IP restrictions to say here are the 10 I want to allow in and drop everything else, or hey, I want to allow US IPs. I mean, there's a lot of options there once you're self-hosting to put that type of security around the application.
Other questions, guys, out there? It's just, you know what? It's just a good reminder. Like, it's been a while since I've been in the LastPass general security settings, advanced user setup, and you're like, oh, I didn't know all these things were available. You can destroy sessions that are out there, automatically remove duplicates. Auto log off was something I didn't take advantage of. So Joe says, I'm accustomed to my mobile only syncing the KeyPass database at night. So the Bitwarden sync wasn't an issue for me. Yeah, KeyPass is another. Did you look at KeyPass because they're kind of aren't they only local?
Yes, they have the KeyPass XC. I'm pretty sure is they're open source, they're free, so those hit my winning things, right? They're pretty well trusted for those reasons, and yes, they have the local only version. So you're gonna find a lot of the InfoSec communities very happy with KeyPass. It's not going to have some of the syncy sexy features that the others do, but it's intentionally open source, lightweight, pretty well vetted. So KeyPass is, if you're interested in that type of technology, it's always a pretty safe bet in terms of what you're going to get from it.
Christian, sometimes when I was using LastPass, the same site would have two different URLs, and it would create it would create that alert because it would say, "Hey, you're using the password twice." As you think about Bitwarden, does it have the ability to remember like, hey, this place and this place? They're, even though they look different, it's the same username and password. So
Yeah,
wouldn't you
so
get that ding?
they have, I haven't played with this too much, but they have within the settings for Bitwarden, you can configure they call them domain rules. And so I'll just read you the description. If you have the same login across multiple different website domains, you can mark the website as equivalent. Global domains are ones already created for you by Bitwarden. So a good example of this is like if you log into Google, once you log into google.com, that already logs you into gmail.com and to youtube.com. And so it uses those global equivalents to associate so that it's not forcing those types of relogins. I don't know if they do it at the URL level. So like if it's the same website, but it's, / whatever, I don't know if that, I don't believe they're doing URL pattern matching on that, but certainly at the domain level, they have a pretty nice feature for this. And you can add custom mappings.
Yeah. Just one of the frustrating things. And I'm sure there's a way around that on LastPass, but it was one of those things I never really figured out. And so I allowed some passwords to say reused because I knew like, oh wait a minute. Okay.
Yeah.
But I'm also a completionist. So I like, I hated those things being out there. Like I want 100%, not 90. I think I was at 97% or something like that. Joe says if you use Cloudflare Tunnel, you get to use your self-host. You get to yourself self-host. you can restrict the source IP as well. Tony asks, do you use your Google account as a sign-on for sites that allow it?
I don't, just because I treat that as increasing your risk, right? Because now only I need to compromise your Google to potentially get into many other things. And I also
it is
hate
a
Google.
form of password management in
Yeah.
itself, then,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
And I also hate Google following me around, so I try to do as little business with Google as I can. So for me, using those types of authentication services is a thank you, but no thank you. There's a reason why they offer that for free. It's so convenient and easy, and it's also very profitable for them. So no, I don't use it personally.
Yeah, I don't either. I like when I get those options. I don't want to tie it to any social media, Facebook, Google, whatever. Just give me an email address if that's what. Hey, let me ask you this question and then we'll wrap it. What about using my phone number, my cell phone number, as a account identifier instead of an email address? Better, worse? Because some sites have that option of putting your cell phone number in. I don't know. What do you think about doing that instead of an email address?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I don't know that I have a strong aversion or support of it one way or another. To me, a phone is a type of communication. It's just a different type of communication. The differences in risk are somewhat nominal. Like if it's your email, you might be sending codes to your email. If it's your phone, you may be getting them texted. I don't recommend either of those typically as two-factor, to be clear, but so from that perspective, fairly equivalent. From the like personal information, yeah, neither here nor there for me. I think it's harder to get disposable phone numbers than it is to get disposable emails. So if you're trying to go for that angle, you may bias towards the email. However, if you really want a disposable phone number, just go to Google Voice and generate a Google Voice phone number, and there you go. So like possible, but a little bit higher effort and maintenance. But I think they're more or less equivalent for this discussion.
Okay, no, it's good. I just was wondering. I know. What was I working on? I was working on something the other day, and they were like email or phone number, and I was like, oh, I haven't seen a lot of that. From an attack surface area perspective, if we thought about randomly generating, so if you're setting up an account, I know they require an email address so they can contact you and verify some of those kinds of things. But if the login name and the email are different, right? If they're different, if it's not tied to that, if in other words, if I can create an account with ABC Supply Company on their website and their username to log in is doesn't necessarily have to be an email address, does it make more sense to make that some kind of random? If I'm going to use a password manager to manage the password, could I also use the password manager to manage the username? And is there any advantage to having it random?
You can, and yeah, absolutely, right? So it's like hacker's going to look for commonality in username, passwords, and emails and other things to build that identity on you. So if you want to just build a 25-digit string for your username the same way as you would as password, I think it's brilliant for a high level of protection is the wrong word, but it certainly better sanitizes your footprint online.
Yeah. Well, it obliterates your
yeah,
online.
And I have certainly I have used this practice before. So it's if you really get your password manager ecosystem set up the way you want it, there's really no reason not to at that point, because it's going to handle it for you.
At some point, you got to give that company whatever your email address, because they have to have a way of communicating with you, right? And so, but that's not forward facing. That's not generally.
Yeah, well, and even then, you can generate a disposable email address or alias that forwards to your real email. that you
True.
can then forward
True.
and
Yeah.
do the verification. So yeah, if
Yeah.
you're really paying attention, you can let the tools do all the heavy lifting while still getting a lot of anonymity.
Yeah. It's a lot of that's a lot of email addresses to manage though. If you're gonna do it that way. Yeah, it's a
Well,
lot.
they're it's not like ones you keep logging into. They're kind
Yeah,
of
yeah, no, right
disposable
on.
one time, you burn them, you're
Yeah.
done.
Yeah. Yeah, no, for sure. Brian says, any thoughts on Apple Password Manager?
Decent. I mean, it's not that the implementation itself is secure and fine and sound. I don't know that I personally have, the me and iCloud are not the bestest of friends. So if you're looking for password synchronization and you want to be through iCloud, I have some feelings about that. So if you're an all-in kind of Apple ecosystem user, it's not a bad option for something that's kind of built in. But it's just okay for me. I would say it doesn't
Yeah.
knock my socks off.
Remember that episode when was it HP you used to really rail on all the time? And I bleeped you out every time you said that, and it sounded like you were swearing. That was
It was fantastic.
That was a fun episode. It was fun. So, all right, friends, thanks for coming out tonight. We'll let you guys go. I've got a question for Christian, but I will ask that as we get off. Thanks for coming out. Go get some rest. Go change your passwords.
Go change them.
We got some work to do. See you guys. We'll see you next week.